It's Christmas Day, 1914. Deep in the trenches of the First World War, exhausted soldiers are huddled against the cold.
Jenkins, Oakley, Knight.
The guns are silent. A lone voice begins a carol, and slowly others join in until the tune of Silent Night can be heard drifting across no man's land.
All is calm, all is bright. Nur das traute hochheilige Paar.
Eventually, the two sides emerge from the trenches.
My name is Jim. Mein Name ist Otto.
And then somebody finds a football.
Danke. Happy Christmas. Frohe Weihnachten.
So what you've just seen is a few clips from a 2014 Christmas advert from Sainsbury's, a British supermarket chain. With more than 26 million views, the advert offers a heartwarming message that even in the middle of unimaginable horror, people can still find a moment of peace and humanity. Now, the Sainsbury's team stated that the advert was inspired by real events from 100 years ago. They say it commemorates the extraordinary events of Christmas Day 1914, when the guns fell silent and two armies met in no man's land, sharing gifts and even playing football together. But did anything like this actually happen? Lots of people think it did. But what's the truth? By December 1914, the First World War had been raging for 4 months. This was the brutal dawn of trench warfare, a form of fighting fueled by new technologies, machine guns, high-explosive artillery, and quick-firing rifles that made traditional open-field battles suicidal. Soldiers sheltered in vast networks of ditches and dugouts that stretched the length of the Western Front, through Belgium and France. Daily life meant mud, lice, rats, disease, and the constant threat of bombardment. And between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a churned-up wasteland of mud, barbed wire, shell holes, and bodies. Now, despite a popular sense held by many at the outset of the war that it would be over by Christmas, by mid-December it was clear that wouldn't happen. But soldiers began trying to recreate some sense of home. So we do have photos of men pulling Christmas puddings from parcels, carving up turkeys or other birds, and opening hampers sent by loved ones to the trenches. We even have photos of a German regiment who'd received a small Christmas tree, which they'd clearly decorated and showcased proudly along their trench line. So we know that troops celebrated Christmas. But the key question remains, did men actually put down their weapons and venture into no man's land for a festive game of football against their enemy? To get to the truth, I spoke with First World War historian Alexandra Churchill for a recent episode of the HistoryExtra podcast. And here's what she had to say.
So I think what people think happened is the equivalent of a Premier League football match with thousands of people watching on a vast open space in no man's land, where there were goalposts and referees, and it was all organised and official. The first thing I always say to people is, think about it. No man's land is full of shell holes. You're not going to get very far playing like on a full-size football pitch because it's going to be full of holes. Also, where do the officials come from? There's no neutrals there. As well, there's no goalpost. So I think there are isolated kickabouts, and people did kick footballs around. The word football does come up. The idea that sort of, I think there's a film, isn't there, with Sylvester Stallone randomly. I think that whole image of a giant football game and a big coming together it's not on the Western Front, I'm afraid, in 1914.
So there was no organised large-scale match. This is a myth. But that doesn't mean football didn't play a part in Christmas 1914. Soldiers did have footballs. In fact, Chelsea Football Club even sent balls to fans serving in the army in a bid to boost morale. And in letters sent home, there were a few accounts of soldiers talking about thinking of having a game of football. Although these instances, if they did happen, and it is obviously rather difficult to confirm reports, would have looked more like small, isolated kickabouts rather than a properly organised match. And there are also a few fantasist accounts of an organised football match taking place. An officer named Peter Jackson claimed to have played football on the front line, but by 1968, he eventually admitted he had made the whole thing up. While football tends to dominate the conversation about the World War I Christmas truce, a more accurate way of looking at what actually happened on the front line would be to examine moments of fraternisation and ceasefires. These truces definitely did happen, although they were not widespread, typically emerging spontaneously and driven by the mood and instincts of the men in different sectors. Some units were more willing to pause for a few hours, while others kept right on fighting. The same can be said of any moments of friendliness between enemy troops. Again, this often began with simple gestures. For instance, soldiers may have been allowed to safely collect their dead, and in some cases, men did walk out, exchange food, tobacco, buttons, badges, things like that with the other side. No story more exemplifies the kind of moments that did happen than that of George Fletcher. George was a territorial officer and languages master at Eton College in Windsor, who spoke fluent German and absolutely loved German culture. So he spent the run-up to Christmas 1914 shouting across no man's land in perfect German, trying to organise a joint celebration. He promised that the British would bring plum pudding, while insisting that the Germans provide sausages and beer. His commanding officer at one point ordered him to stop being ridiculous. The Germans weren't biting either. Fletcher's own sector ended up having no truce at all, and he was so annoyed that he simply walked along the trench line to another unit, a Scottish battalion, where, to his delight, a truce was happening. Here's Alex explaining what happened.
When people started popping over the trenches on Christmas Day in 1914, he was a bit miffed because nothing really happened on his front. With the Welsh battalion. So he went for a wander. So he wandered down to a Scottish battalion next door, and actually that's where he experienced the Christmas truce. And yes, there were men running around with a football, and I think he swapped business cards with some Germans. They had a chat, they shared some cigarettes, and then it kind of got a bit rowdy, and the men were scampering in and out of each other's trenches, and he saw one of the Scotsmen kind of like lumping back towards the British trenches with a heater under his arm that he'd either stolen or a German had given him. And I think George says at that point we kind of thought there's probably a lot of future reconnaissance that might do us in going on at the moment, and I think we need to be a bit more sensible about letting the enemy rampage around our lines. So they kind of put a stop to it and called everybody back. So that's a good example of what did happen, and it does have participation from both Germans and British.
So this is the reality of the many varied stories behind the Christmas Truce of 1914. And importantly, it didn't happen in the same way again. By Christmas 1915, commanders were explicitly forbidding fraternisation. By 1917, anyone who attempted it faced disciplinary action. Why? Though it might have presented a glimmer of humanity for many amid brutal trench warfare and unimaginably hard living conditions, the High Command understood something vital. It's far more difficult to shoot a man you've just shared a cigarette with. So, what are we to make of all this? Did the World War I Christmas football truce really happen? Not the way the legend suggests. There was no grand match with hundreds of players and tidy goalposts, but there were maybe scattered kickabouts, friendly exchanges, shared songs, and brief ceasefires across the trenches. What happened on Christmas Day 1914 wasn't one coordinated truce, but a patchwork of small expressions of hope and normality amid one of the bleakest conflicts in history. And perhaps that reality is more powerful than the myth.